Dr. Klaus Hartmann arrived at Station Epsilon under the cover of a moonless night. The road leading to the facility was lined with dead trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, and the wind carried a strange metallic tang that seemed to cling to his lungs. His car tires crunched over gravel, echoing in the oppressive silence. The facility itself loomed like a sentinel of some forgotten war, walls taller than any conventional building, reinforced with steel plates and windows too high to see inside. Hartmann had been briefed minimally, almost cryptically. He knew only that the facility was engaged in a secretive project designated V-27, and his task was to observe anomalies, document the unexpected, and maintain discretion. No further details were given. Upon entering, he was struck by the sheer scale of the corridors. They seemed to extend endlessly, with white tiles reflecting fluorescent lights that flickered sporadically, casting long, wavering shadows. Each turn revealed more chambers, each lined with thick glass and filled with black, viscous liquids with human silhouettes suspended inside. Some were entirely still, others moved ever so slightly, like the faint stirring of a dream caught in half-consciousness. He was greeted by Wagner, the project director. Wagner's presence was imposing, yet silent. He did not speak much, but his eyes followed Hartmann as though measuring the very essence of his being. The other scientists were equally unnerving. Precise, silent, efficient, yet strangely detached. As they walked through the facility, Wagner explained in minimal terms the purpose of V-27. It was more than a chemical compound. It was a cognitive catalyst designed to influence neural pathways, alter perception, and eventually manipulate consciousness. Hartmann's role was not to intervene, but to observe and report any inconsistencies, any deviations from expected behavior in the subjects. Passing the first chamber, Hartmann's breath caught. Inside floated a human figure, submerged in the black liquid. Its limbs were suspended as if weightless, and yet there was a tension to its posture, a latent awareness that felt like it was staring directly at him. When Hartmann glanced at his reflection in the glass, he had a brief, disorienting sense that the figure mimicked him, tilting its head in subtle imitation. This was the beginning of his descent into a reality where life, identity, and memory were malleable, and where death was merely a transition into a controlled experiment. Dr. Klaus Hartmann spent the next morning preparing for the first live test. The subject, a former soldier named Richter, had volunteered or perhaps been selected for reasons never fully explained. Hartmann observed silently as Wagner's instructions were delivered with clinical precision. Every movement of the medical team was rehearsed, precise, and devoid of empathy, as though the subjects were merely components in a machine rather than human beings. The compound, V-27, was administered intravenously. Hartmann monitored Richter's vital signs and brainwave activity, scribbling notes in meticulous detail. Initially, Richter appeared calm, almost serene, but that illusion shattered within moments. The subject's eyes shifted unnaturally, pupils dilating and contracting in irregular patterns. His speech became fragmented, repeating phrases Hartmann did not recognize. It was not Richter speaking, but the amalgamation of voices, possibly from other subjects or from previous experiments. Wagner observed silently, his gaze unwavering, as if he anticipated every twitch, every reaction. Hartmann realized the significance. V-27 did not merely enhance cognition. It preserved, replicated, and layered consciousness. The subject was simultaneously alive, a recording, and a vessel for memories that were not his own. Hours passed, and Richter's condition fluctuated between lucidity and an almost mechanical mimicry of identity. His body twitched as if reacting to unseen stimuli. Hartmann recorded the subtle changes in neural activity, noting patterns that suggested the compound could overwrite identity in fragments, allowing multiple consciousnesses to coexist within a single host. Wagner finally spoke. "This is only phase 1. Soon, we will not require living volunteers. The compound will preserve identity beyond death, and memory will be archived, transferable. Death is merely a limitation for those unwilling to surrender control." Hartmann felt a chill run through his spine. The implications were staggering. V-27 represented a fundamental redefinition of life, memory, and death. This was no longer a medical experiment. It was a blueprint for immortality, or an artificial approximation of it, horrifying in its execution. The subject's eyes flickered toward Hartmann for a fleeting moment. recognizing him not as an observer, but as part of the system. It was then Hartmann realized the first rule of Station Epsilon. Observation was participation. The act of witnessing bound him to the experiment in ways he could not yet comprehend. By the end of the day, Richter was unconscious, though alive, yet undeniably changed. Hartmann documented everything in exhaustive detail, aware that each note, each observation could later serve as evidence or a warning of what V-27 had begun to do. He left the lab that evening unsettled, his thoughts preoccupied with the moral and existential consequences. Consciousness could be copied, controlled, and preserved artificially. But at what cost? And more importantly, what would happen if the compound reached beyond the walls of Station Epsilon? The answers, he feared, were already unfolding. Weeks passed, and the facility became a labyrinth of silent horrors. New subjects were introduced daily, each with a unique response to V-27. Some perished immediately. Their bodies could not withstand the compound's effects. Others survived, but their consciousness fractured, splintering into multiple streams of awareness. They spoke not as themselves, but as amalgamations of past subjects, echoing memories of experiences they never lived. Hartmann observed these changes with a mixture of scientific curiosity and growing dread. The facility itself seemed to react to every anomaly. Doors would open or close without human intervention. Shadows moved independently in his peripheral vision. Even the air felt alive, carrying faint whispers that seemed just beyond comprehension. One evening, Hartmann discovered that a subject had vanished completely. The chamber was empty, and all monitoring systems were wiped clean. Security logs recorded nothing. No alarms had been triggered. When Hartmann inquired with the staff, they denied seeing the individual at all. Their eyes were vacant, as though trained to ignore the impossible. Hartmann realized a horrifying truth. V-27 could erase not only consciousness, but the very record of existence. Lives could be obliterated, leaving no trace, as if they had never existed. And yet, fragments lingered, fleeting shadows, residual memories, or subtle echoes in other subjects. The psychological toll on Hartmann was immediate. He began to doubt his own perceptions. Were the whispers he heard real, or a side effect of prolonged exposure to V-27? Were the shadows following him, or were they products of his fractured mind? Station Epsilon was no longer merely a research facility. It was an ecosystem of consciousness, blending life, death, and memory into an indistinguishable whole. Wagner's presence offered little comfort. He remained calm, almost godlike in his detachment, guiding Hartmann's observations without revealing the full scope of the experiment. "Endurance is the test," Wagner said quietly. "Understanding comes not from intervention, but from survival. You will see the truth if you endure." By the end of the week, Hartmann documented a chilling pattern. Subjects disappeared, consciousness replicated, and fragments of identity integrated seamlessly into the remaining population. The boundary between living and dead, self and other, was dissolving. Hartmann understood the magnitude of what was happening. Station Epsilon was not just manipulating life, it was rewriting the concept of identity itself. The experiment had moved beyond the physical realm into the intangible, where thought, memory, and perception became the new laboratory. And in this silent war of consciousness, every observer was at risk of becoming both participant and subject. Hartmann's sleepless nights had become routine. Every step he took through Station Epsilon was measured, deliberate, as though the facility itself were watching him. The corridors were endless, and the sterile white tiles reflected more than just light. They mirrored his own anxiety, magnifying it. At the heart of the facility lay the corridor of glass, a long stretch of chambers, each containing subjects in various states, suspended in black liquid, restrained in mechanical devices, or in stasis. Each glass panel was thick and reinforced, but Hartmann could feel the subtle movement of the forms within, as if they were alive, aware, and watching him in return. He approached one tank with a label that read, Epsilon Black, Subject Alpha 1. Inside floated a figure whose face he instantly recognized, Dr. Weiss. Or perhaps Hartmann realized with growing dread it was only a fragment of Weiss, like preserved within the compound and transformed by V-27. The subtle movements of the subject seemed deliberate, almost intelligent, as if it could respond to Hartmann's thoughts. Further down the corridor, other chambers revealed even more disturbing subjects. Children, adolescents, adults, all suspended in the viscous black liquid. Their expressions were varied: calm, terrified, vacant, or subtly shifting between multiple emotions in a way that defied normal human psychology. Hartmann noticed faint markings etched into the tanks, notes on neural activity, memory integration, and cognitive mimicry. He felt an inexplicable unease as he observed. The compound did not merely alter consciousness, it could replicate it, layer it, and manipulate it. Faces within the tanks occasionally turned toward him in ways that suggested recognition, and sometimes a flicker of his own expression appeared across multiple subjects. Wagner appeared silently, standing beside him without making a sound. "Observe closely," he said. "This is where identity begins to merge, where consciousness becomes transferable. You see Weiss, but Weiss is no longer a man. He is a system integrated into the framework of V-27. Hartmann swallowed hard. The moral and psychological weight of the experiment pressed upon him. Station Epsilon was not just breaking scientific boundaries. It was erasing and rewriting the rules of existence itself. He moved cautiously through the corridor, noting that the lighting and reflections were subtly manipulated. Hallways appeared longer or shorter, or depending on the angle, and shadows flickered in ways that were almost sentient. Hartmann realized that perception was as much a part of the experiment as the compound itself. Observers could be tested, trapped, and reshaped psychologically, just as the subjects were physically and mentally altered. At the far end of the corridor, a single cot was smeared with dark stains, accompanied by a message scrawled directly onto the glass: "We never slept." The implication was terrifying. Station Epsilon was alive in its own way, and every consciousness within it, observer or subject, was a component in a system that refused to rest. Hartmann returned to his office to record detailed notes, aware that each observation might be critical evidence or a warning. V-27 was no longer an experiment limited to chemical or biological parameters. It was an architecture of identity, memory, and perception, and the corridors of glass were the central artery through which the lifeblood of this horrifying experiment flowed. It was an early morning when Hartmann arrived at the pathology wing to discover the absence of Dr. Adler, the head of pathology. No trace of him existed in the daily logs, no entry for his arrival, no sign of departure. The chamber where he had been working was immaculate, as though he had never been there. Files and personal effects had vanished. The monitors displayed only static. Hartmann's heart raced as the realization hit him. Dr. Adler had not died. He had been erased. Hartmann reviewed archival logs and discovered cryptic entries, designations like Subject Reintegration Trial 3B, replacing Adler's name. Every attempt to trace his movements ended in contradictions, gaps, and impossible sequences. It was as though V-27 had not only manipulated Adler's consciousness, but had removed him from reality itself, leaving only echoes in the memories of those who had known him. He began to notice subtle signs of the compound's reach beyond the subjects. Equipment occasionally displayed residual neural activity where none should exist. Shadows in corridors seemed to move independently, lingering just long enough to give a sense of recognition. Occasionally, whispers reached Hartmann's ears, fragments of conversations of thoughts not his own, a haunting echo of the missing doctor. The psychological weight became nearly unbearable. Hartmann found himself questioning reality. Were the whispers hallucinations induced by proximity to V-27, or evidence that the compound had begun to influence the observers? Were the shadows merely tricks of the mind, or agents of the experiment itself? Wagner offered no solace. Standing silently, he allowed Hartmann's fears to grow, knowing that observation alone was a critical element of the experiment. "Every disappearance is data," Wagner said, almost casually. "And every observer is a variable. You must learn to endure, or you too may become integrated." Hartmann continued his documentation with obsessive precision. He noted patterns in disappearances, replication of consciousness, and subtle distortions in the facility's perception of time and space. V-27 was evolving, expanding beyond the laboratory's physical confines into a cognitive realm where reality itself was malleable. The implication was horrifying. Identity could be removed, rewritten, and redistributed. The compound was not a chemical tool alone, but a system capable of reshaping existence, and those who witnessed it, observers like Hartmann, were not exempt. Every reflection, every shadow, every fleeting memory became part of the experiment. By the end of the week, Hartmann had compiled exhaustive notes recognizing the scope of the operation. Station Epsilon was no longer merely a facility conducting unethical experiments. It had become an ecosystem of consciousness where memory, identity, and perception were fluid, malleable, and controllable. The vanishing doctor was the ultimate warning. No one, not even the most prominent scientists, was safe from the reach of V-27. Hartmann had begun to notice something deeply unsettling. His own reflection no longer mirrored him accurately. In mirrors, windows, and even the glossy surfaces of lab equipment, his image moved with subtle delays, sometimes tilting its head when he did not, sometimes smiling faintly when he remained expressionless. It was as though the compound V-27 had begun extending its influence beyond the subjects and into the consciousness of the observers themselves. At first, Hartmann tried to rationalize these occurrences. Fatigue, stress, and the oppressive atmosphere of Station Epsilon could easily account for visual anomalies. But the longer he observed, the clearer it became. The reflections acted independently. They were testing him, tracking his attention, responding to his thoughts, and at times appearing moments before he realized he had moved. The psychological toll was profound. Hartmann's nights became filled with disjointed dreams and half-formed hallucinations. Every shadow in the corridors seemed to stretch, linger, and whisper fragments of thought. He began avoiding reflective surfaces, but even the faintest glimpse of polished metal caused a spike in adrenaline. The compound's reach was now both chemical and psychological. One night, Hartmann stood before a mirror in a corridor, staring at his reflection. Slowly, the mirrored image lifted its hand before he did, its eyes locking onto his with unnerving intent. For the first time, he felt the raw presence of V-27 outside of a test subject, as if the system itself had become sentient, aware, and capable of interaction with the mind of the observer. He realized the terrifying truth. Station Epsilon was no longer simply a laboratory. It had evolved into a sentient ecosystem where consciousness, perception, and identity were the instruments and the measured outcomes. Observers were not merely witnesses. They were participants subjected to the same manipulations as the test subjects. Wagner's presence during these observations became more ominous. He offered no guidance, only a silent affirmation that Hartmann's fear and growing paranoia were part of the experiment. "Perception is data," Wagner remarked quietly. "Your mind is now as much a part of V-27 as the subjects themselves. Endurance will determine survival." Hartmann's notes became increasingly obsessive. He recorded every movement of shadows, every flicker in his reflection, every whispered fragment that seemed to echo inside his mind. V-27 was not confined to physical boundaries. It had entered the realm of thought, observation, and identity. By the end of that week, Hartmann's understanding of Station Epsilon had shifted dramatically. He was no longer simply documenting the experiments. He was becoming a subject within them. Every glance, every reflection, every whisper carried data, and the compound was using it to refine its reach. The empty reflection was not just a phenomenon. It was a warning. Consciousness itself was malleable, and Station Epsilon had found a way to manipulate it in ways that blurred the line between reality and perception. Hartmann now faced a chilling reality. Survival would require more than physical escape. It would demand mastery over his own mind, and perhaps a confrontation with a system that could mimic, manipulate, and ultimately control identity itself. Hartmann's restless nights and growing paranoia eventually led him to a discovery that would change everything. Deep beneath Station Epsilon, behind a reinforced steel door hidden under maintenance panels, he found a hidden laboratory, a place that even Wagner had never formally mentioned. The lab was vast, illuminated by cold, sterile lights that reflected off black liquid tanks arranged in precise rows. Each tank contained a human form suspended in viscous fluid, from adults to children, their faces peaceful yet unnervingly aware. Hartmann moved cautiously, noting the intricate network of electrodes, monitoring devices, and neural mapping instruments attached to each subject. Detailed logs revealed the magnitude of the experiments. Neural patterns were being copied, transferred, and integrated across multiple hosts. Memories were cataloged, fragmented, and reassembled. Every subject was part of a larger system, a complex web of consciousness spanning life, death and artificial preservation. Hartmann's breath caught as he examined one tank labeled Weiss Subject Epsilon Prime. Inside floated Dr. Weiss, or perhaps the remnant of him, not alive in the conventional sense, but a preserved consciousness embedded in the compound. The subtle movement of his hands, the faint awareness in his eyes, suggested intelligence, intent, and memory retained within a liquid prison. The implications were staggering. Station Epsilon was not merely experimenting with human cognition. It was constructing a new form of existence, one capable of storing multiple consciousnesses simultaneously, rewriting identity, and integrating memory in ways that defied natural law. Hartmann meticulously documented the findings, aware that he was standing at the intersection of life, death, and the manipulation of human essence. Every step he took through the hidden lab carried profound psychological weight. The compound was no longer contained. It had evolved into a system capable of preserving, replicating, and controlling consciousness at will. He realized the horrifying truth. Dr. Weiss had not disappeared. He had been absorbed into the system, his identity fragmented and integrated across the experimental network. V-27 had transformed him into a node within the laboratory's ecosystem, part of the architecture itself. The lab also contained data indicating a planned expansion. The project aimed to perfect cognitive replication and eventually extend influence beyond the facility. Hartmann understood that the consequences of this research were not limited to Station Epsilon. The knowledge, if released, could redefine the boundaries of human identity worldwide. As he explored further, he noticed faint traces of past staff who had vanished. Their consciousness, partially preserved, flickered in the tanks like residual echoes. The line between observer, subject, and participant had blurred completely. Hartmann understood with a deepening sense of dread that every action, every observation he made, fed into the experiment. He was no longer a mere witness. He had become part of the system. The hidden lab was not just a secret chamber beneath the facility. It was the heart of V-27, the core from which the experiment's influence radiated. And standing there, surrounded by suspended forms and whispers of memories that were not his own, Hartmann felt the full psychological weight of his knowledge. The project was alive, intelligent, and growing stronger every day. Hartmann's growing understanding of V-27 and Station Epsilon turned into urgent fear. The deeper he delved, the more he realized that the facility itself seemed aware of his movements, almost as if the walls, corridors, and shadows were extensions of the compound's intelligence. One night, Hartmann attempted to move through the lower levels undetected. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shapes along the walls. Shadows seemed to slither independently, sometimes moving ahead of him, other times trailing behind in impossible synchronization. It became clear. The experiment extended beyond the subjects. It was now influencing his perception, testing his mental endurance. As he navigated the labyrinthine corridors, he glimpsed fleeting forms in the corner of his vision. Faces, some familiar, some completely alien, appeared and disappeared. Some of the images were distorted versions of himself, as if V-27 had replicated his consciousness within the shadows to monitor and challenge him. Every turn he took seemed predetermined. Doors led to the same corridors, hallways shifted subtly, and even staircases appeared to loop back on themselves. Hartmann's fear escalated as he realized he was not merely escaping physically, he was being tested psychologically. The experiment had grown beyond biological and chemical manipulation into a form of cognitive warfare. Perception, memory, and identity were now the battlegrounds, and V-27 was the invisible adversary. He tried to calm himself, reminding his mind of known physical laws, but the shadows, reflections, and disembodied voices seemed to anticipate every logical move. Whispers repeated fragments of his own thoughts, but with subtle changes, as if the facility were conversing with him in a language only he could hear. Through long corridors and hidden passageways, Hartmann's flight became desperate. The boundaries of the physical facility seemed to bend around him. Doors that should have been locked opened without explanation. Hallways twisted into impossible angles. It was as if the building itself had merged with V-27's cognitive network, turning the labyrinth into a living extension of the experiment. He felt the presence of Dr. Weiss everywhere, not physically, but as an echo in the system. Hartmann realized that Weiss, integrated into V-27, had become both observer and operator, guiding the traps, shadows, and illusions. Survival depended not just on speed or strength, but on mental acuity and resistance to psychological manipulation. After hours that seemed like days, Hartmann stumbled into a service tunnel. The shadows lingered at the edges of his vision, pulsating subtly as though aware of his movements. He pressed on, knowing that escape from the facility was no longer guaranteed by physical means alone. V-27 had already infiltrated his mind, and every step, thought, and decision could be anticipated and manipulated. The chase through shadows was not merely a flight. It was a confrontation with the very essence of perception and identity. And in that confrontation, Hartmann began to understand the true scale of the experiment. Station Epsilon was alive, intelligent, and its reach extended far beyond any single chamber or corridor. Hartmann had reached the limits of his endurance. Every corridor, every shadow, every flickering light seemed to conspire against him. The corridors of Station Epsilon had become a psychological trap as much as a physical one. His mind strained under the constant barrage of whispers, reflections, and fleeting images of subjects long vanished. Determined, he discovered a narrow ventilation shaft leading toward the surface. It was tight, claustrophobic, and the air was thick with chemical residue from the compound. Crawling through the shaft, Hartmann felt every nerve in his body alert, every shadow outside the metal walls threatening. The compound's influence had become pervasive. Even the metallic vibrations of the ventilation seemed to mimic sounds from the lab, creating hallucinations that tested his grip on reality. As he navigated the twists and turns, he realized the experiment had grown intelligent. Shadows and distorted reflections mirrored him, anticipating movements as if the facility itself were alive and observing, learning from every hesitation or misstep. Hartmann understood that escape required not just physical skill, but mental discipline. Every thought needed scrutiny, every impulse controlled. Emerging from the shaft, he found himself in a small courtyard. The night was calm, almost deceptively so. Station Epsilon loomed behind him, massive, silent, and seemingly omnipotent. The black liquid tanks, the suspended subjects, and the whispers of consciousness now belonged to a system that extended beyond walls, beyond life itself. Hartmann ran into the forest, the cold night air biting at his lungs. He dared not look back, fearing even a glance might trigger some unseen mechanism, some cognitive tether still connected to V-27. But the knowledge of what he had seen, documented, and survived weighed heavily on him. The compound's reach might extend far beyond the confines of the facility. Even as he moved through the dense trees, Hartmann felt traces of V-27 in his mind. Fleeting thoughts, faint echoes of subjects, and subtle manipulations of perception. The experiment had not ended. It had merely extended into his consciousness. The escape attempt was a partial victory. Hartmann had left Station Epsilon physically, but psychologically, he remained trapped. He had survived the labyrinth of shadows, the cognitive manipulation, and the horrors of suspended consciousness. Yet he knew the compound was not finished with him. Every decision, every memory, every fleeting thought could still be observed, replicated, and analyzed. By the time dawn broke, Hartmann had reached the edge of the forest and paused to catch his breath. The world outside appeared ordinary, peaceful even, but he knew better. Station Epsilon, V-27, and the hidden lab were alive within him. Every heartbeat, every reflection, every whisper was a reminder. Survival had its price, and consciousness could never again be taken for granted. Hartmann had survived Station Epsilon, but survival came with a weight far greater than physical escape. Settling in a quiet city, he worked meticulously to compile the Black File, a comprehensive record of the experiments, the vanished subjects, and the cognitive horrors of V-27. Every note, diagram, and observation was carefully documented. The world outside remained oblivious to the magnitude of the project, yet Hartmann knew the truth. V-27 was not merely a compound. It was a system capable of rewriting identity itself. He shared portions of his work anonymously with select historians and researchers, leaving cryptic notes alongside his detailed reports. Most dismissed it as sensational, impossible, or exaggerated. But Hartmann knew the reality. The experiments had created an ecosystem where consciousness could be preserved, duplicated, and manipulated. A system that did not rest, and whose influence could extend far beyond the facility. Even in his apparent safety, Hartmann felt the lingering presence of Station Epsilon. Reflections in windows, fleeting images in shadows, and whispers of memory, fragments of subjects, and perhaps even Dr. Weiss, haunted him. He realized that escape had been physical. The psychological and cognitive entanglement persisted. He was now part of the experiment's extended reach. Years later, Hartmann received a photograph and a note slipped under his door. Weiss continues. The image depicted a shadowed figure in the corner of an abandoned facility. The handwriting was unmistakable, a chilling reminder that the consciousness of Dr. Weiss, integrated into V-27, endured, evolving, and observing. Hartmann's work became a testament, a warning to anyone who dared investigate the boundaries of life, death, and identity. The Black File revealed not just the experiments of Station Epsilon, but the terrifying potential of science unbound by morality. Consciousness, he concluded, was no longer solely the property of the living. It could be archived, manipulated, and weaponized. He reflected on his journey through the facility, the corridors of glass, the vanished subjects, the shadows that mirrored his thoughts, and the hidden lab where Dr. Weiss and countless others were preserved within the black liquid. Each chapter of the experiment had been a test of perception, endurance, and morality. The observers, including himself, had become participants in a system that blurred the line between observer and subject, life and replication, reality and manipulation. In the end, Hartmann accepted that the story could never be fully told. Official records had been destroyed, the evidence scattered, and the true scale of Station Epsilon's operations erased from history. Yet the Black File survived as a fragment of memory, a carefully guarded account of a reality that the world was not prepared to confront. Hartmann's last entry was both a warning and a confession. Science without conscience does not end with death. It continues in shadows, in reflections, in the minds of those who witness it. I escaped the walls of Station Epsilon, but V-27 endures. It observes, it remembers, it evolves. And I know with certainty that this experiment has not ended. It never will. The file was sealed, hidden, yet the knowledge it contained carried a resonance far greater than any physical threat. It was a testament to the fragility of identity and the dangers of human curiosity untempered by morality. And for Dr. Klaus Hartmann, the experiment had never truly ended. It lived on in every shadow, every reflection, and every thought he could not control. The Black File was a record, a warning, and a mirror into the darkest corners of human ambition, where consciousness itself could be manipulated, controlled, and preserved beyond death. And as the final words were written, Hartmann understood the most terrifying truth. Station Epsilon, V-27, and the consciousness of Dr. Weiss had already become more than an experiment. They had become an enduring presence, one that would silently shape the world, unseen, unfathomable, and unstoppable.